Good evening, everyone. It's Wednesday night, and as part of our free webinars during Mental Health Awareness Week tonight, we are very pleased to host Aly McNicoll, and she's going to do a webinar, 40-minute webinar on dealing with difficult personalities. Aly, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Natalie. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Fantastic to be a part of Mental Health Awareness Week webinar series, and fantastic that so many of you have enrolled. I think we had 279 enrollments, and people are arriving quite quickly as we start, which is fantastic, but also a little bit sad maybe that so many people feel the need to jump on the webinar about managing difficult personalities at work, and it says something for how many people's lives this issue has touched, and maybe also how ill-equipped we are to deal with it. We haven't necessarily, particularly as leaders, been given the skills and tools to be able to step up to the issues that we're going to talk about in the webinar. I was just thinking of where my interest in this topic started. I work a lot with leaders. I work a lot with not-for-profit leaders, but with leaders cross-sector who want to get the best out of the people they lead by taking a coaching approach to their leadership. And I have a course called Leaders as Coaches. And the very first time I ran the course, I always get people to bring real examples to the table so that they can get a few problems solved while they're on the course. And most of the examples people were raising, I'd listen to, and I'd have to say, oh, well, actually, that example's a little bit out of the norm. Probably coaching is not going to be an appropriate solution for that particular example. And I quickly came to realize that there was a small proportion of the work or volunteer force. We call them the 5%ers. So there's a small proportion of people who actually cause 95% of the problems for leaders. And they are who they are, bless them. You know, they're probably not going to change a lot, just a small proportion of people who are to some degree dysfunctional, and it's usually their interpersonal style that creates havoc, their typical operating style, their way of engaging with others that is problematic. And it occurred to me that as leaders, we need to learn to recognize quite quickly, recognize our 5%ers, because they need managing quite differently to most of the people that we work with or lead. They probably need therapy, not management, is the reality there, and we're not in the business of therapy in the workplace as leaders particularly. So I thought what we'd look at in our short workshop today is really to help you identify your 5%ers. Let's do a little bit of naming. I always think if you're going to declare a war on something, you first, if you want to win the war on something, you first have to declare the war. So it's actually been quite powerful just to help leaders name some of the difficulties they've been experiencing with people, to help them give it a name, to help them recognize, to help them realize there are different strategies they need to employ. And sometimes I work with leaders who've literally turned themselves inside out trying to make it work for someone. How many of you work in the not-for-profit sector? If we just do a quick show of hands, we might see on the screens. Fantastic, yeah. I think this is a particularly important issue for us in the sector because of the size of the missions that we take on. Massive, massive, sometimes impossible missions. And then we're given this many resources as well to deliver on those. So your people are your best resource, aren't they, in the sector? Definitely your people are your best resource. And if anyone needs everybody working harmoniously, productively, happily together, it's the not-for-profit organisation, I think. And that's certainly a big part of my mission in the work that I do. I think it's people's human right, really, to come to work, enjoy their experience, have good connections with colleagues, and go home feeling like they've made a contribution and wanting to come back the next day. So that's why I take every opportunity I can just to do little short webinars or little short sessions on this particular topic so we can keep our eyes to it. Now I'm going to draw on some research, some reasonably recent research that's come through around this area. And I'm going to share my screen in order to do that. I'm going to give you a few opportunities along the way to have some input through the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And Natalie's going to be keeping an eye on that. So please put your questions in there. We'll pause at a few different spots and, you know, hear what some of the questions are and see if we can give you some tips and tricks to apply in your own workplace setting. But yeah, let's use that as much as we can. So I was going to draw on this recent research. A couple of colleagues of mine in the States, psychologists, they decided to survey leaders. They surveyed over 400 leaders, and they had asked them to tell their stories, whether they'd ever had to deal with, their term was, a toxic personality in the workplace, what their experience was of that, how they approached it, what worked and what didn't. And it's a fantastic read. It's in all the public libraries. I'd really recommend this piece of research. And here's their definition of a toxic personality. I prefer to just focus on the behaviours, the toxic behaviours, but the term they used was the toxic personalities. And they defined that as individuals who demonstrate a pattern of counterproductive work behaviours that actually debilitate or undermine individuals, work teams, and sometimes entire organisations. I have seen organisations who restructure themselves to try and deal with a particularly challenging personality in the midst. Now I'm just going to highlight that word pattern. That's an important feature of this zone. It is people's typical operating style, as I've said. They'd probably be like this no matter where they worked. So we're not talking about people who are just a little bit unhappy or have their nose out of joint because of a recent change or a bit stressed. So that is an important word, that it's a pattern. And I don't know if you've been in the situation where you have a difficult personality in the mix, something happens in the workplace and everybody knows exactly how the person is going to react. It's a very typical operating style. So I'm going to ask Natalie to launch a poll. Does everyone know how to respond to the poll? It'll come up on your screen. And I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I'm going to do a quick poll and ask you if you've ever had to work alongside or manage someone who you think might fit this definition of a toxic personality. Have you ever been managed by someone who fits this definition? Because that's not uncommon. Abuse of authority and power is often part of the syndrome. So sometimes we find these folks in quite senior positions. And does anyone think they perhaps fit the definition themselves? Well, we'll have a very small percentage there, I think, because one of the things I notice about our toxic personalities is that they very rarely come to training. They don't tend to engage in development processes like planning, coaching, mentoring, or supervision. Wow, that's a pretty high percentage for this group, but not uncommon. When I survey a face-to-face group, we'll often end up in the 90% zone. Okay, has everyone had a chance to do that? I think we could close the poll there, Natalie. Have you displayed the results, Natalie? There we go. Natalie is my techie today. Have those results been displayed? Or are they just on my screen,
Yes.
Natalie?
So
They
they
have.
are.
Thank you. Okay, I'll close those down. Oops, my screen's frozen there. That's not good. So I might get you to pop in chat. You know, what are some of the costs of the toxic behaviours? What are some of the costs of toxic personalities in the workplace in your experience? Let's pop those into chat and see what comes through. We've got good workers leaving, we've got time, we've got morale, chronic stress and burnout. So that's the mental health costs, both on colleagues and leaders. Unhappy staff, there's a huge cost to that, lower productivity. We have sick leave, frustration, and burnout, low team performance. I left an organisation as that was the key reason. Mental health issues, well-being of the team, difficulty communicating, segregation of team members. People tend to isolate themselves or remove themselves from the discomfort, loss of sleep, disruption to organisational processes, staff turnover, feeling unworthy, feeling like you can't deal with something, and definitely the poor customer experience. Losing faith in the leaders who don't step up and address the behaviours. And someone says, I'm leaving because of this. Yeah. So huge costs. And once again, I would just really highlight that those are costs that as a not-for-profit organisation particularly, we can't afford. We just don't have the wriggle room there. Employment grievances, people being taken to court and ending up doubting yourself. Okay, just a couple I'd add to that would be loss of reputation, sometimes organisational reputation. Sometimes teams who struggle with this issue find that other people don't want to join them. They find it hard to recruit and retain the good staff. So massive costs. And there has been an interesting piece of research coming through just recently as well. I'm hoping this is going to move. Yeah, and you know, I mean, this is my central message just before we look at the costs of incivility research. But my central message when I go and talk to groups about this issue is to just remind people just how non-negotiable civility, respect and regard are, particularly in a not-for-profit organisation. And I usually start a presentation with the basic message that because of the missions that we take on in the not-for-profit sector, you know, social justice, non-violence, inclusion, equity, righting wrongs, because of the missions that we take on, then if we can't get it first right ourselves inside our organisation, then quite frankly, I don't think we have any right to ask society to pull their socks up around our missions and the issues that we are fighting for. So I truly believe that in a not-for-profit organisation, civility, respect and regard should be non-negotiable, and we do need to tidy our house up first. I find that word civility quite a helpful word. I find myself using civility as a word and professional behaviour as a word as well. It seems people seem to know what civil is a little bit clearer than the word respect, which can be open to interpretation.
My video just go again. It says your video is stopped.
Okay. I just want to check who that is, Nat. Yeah, so there is some interesting research on the tangible costs of incivility, and this is by from Poeth and Poeth and published with permission of Cynthia Clark. But useful to think of it as a continuum, and often incivility does start with being or slightly irritating or distracting, low intensity behaviours, which often build from there. So it's very common for things to start small and to escalate over time if they're unaddressed. And I just really highlight that because one of the big strategies for dealing with this particular zone is that the earlier you step up, the more likely you are to have a result. And I will often work with an organisation or a team who may have been challenged by a difficult personality for 7 years, or they may have been through 1, 2 or 3 teams in the same organisation and no one has really stepped up and to address the issues. And on the other end of the continuum, we do have aggressive, potentially violent behaviours, high-risk behaviours, threatening behaviours. We have many examples from New Zealand courts where we have had very dysfunctional behaviour with tragic results, and they have been inflicted by people who have been working in workplaces. And yeah, some of the behaviours are less direct, they are more subtle, passive-aggressive behaviours, and some have been alarming, and I still get shocked by some of the examples I hear in people's stories around this area. So what the research looked at, they looked at some very large organisations to try and identify the costs, and they pretty much mirrored what you folks just put in chat. And the research found that 12% of people who were affected by incivility in the workplace quit. They chose not to stay. And who do we lose? Usually it's the good people, the people we actually want to keep. They found that 68% of people reported loss of productivity. They found 47% of people reported decrease in their time spent to not be there. We had an alarming 78% of people reported a loss of commitment to their organisation, and I think someone mentioned loss of faith in the leaders in the chat before. And the most alarming one for me was that 25% of people admitted taking their frustrations out on customers or clients. And I think that's the big one we have to watch in the not-for-profit sector, that when frustration, dissatisfaction builds up, then people release it somewhere, either at home, on other colleagues, or with the clients or the customers that they're working with. I've got a slide here that talks about a quote from the Toxic Workplace Research. Says the day this person left is still considered an annual holiday in our organisation. Such was the relief. And sometimes that's how you tell that you've got a 5%er in the mix, is that when they go on leave, everyone like relaxes, or when they come back from leave, everyone like goes, what's this again? Yeah.
We've got a question in the chat box, Aly.
Great, thanks, Natalie.
And someone is asking, Aly, what is your theory for the motivation for these behaviours, please?
Okay. And can I say, who knows what experiences these folks have been through in their lives to cause them to need to act this way, to survive, really, to look after themselves. So I think it's helpful to take a no blame, no shame approach, but still we need to hold people accountable for civil behaviour in the workplace. And so that is why I tend to view the problem as a problem with behaviours rather than the person. It's the toxic behaviours that cause the problems in the workplace. And I think we also need to note it's actually a leader's or an organisation's legal responsibility to provide an emotionally safe, a psychologically safe workplace for people. That, yeah, it's really important that we do step up. I've only once ever ran a workshop once, and I asked anyone, I sort of just tongue-in-cheek ask anyone if they think they may be the toxic personality in the mix, and one person firmly put her hand up and she said, you know, I used to be that was absolutely me, that would describe me. And I took the opportunity and said to her, so what happened? And she said, I said, how come? And she said, I was just surrounded by toxic relationships all my life. That is the environment that I've been brought up in. So often these behaviours are coping strategies for some very dysfunctional environments that people have had exposure to. So just highlighting the importance of psychological safety in your team. I get to do a bit of team building in my work, and it's quite frankly not team building by the time people give me a call. It's usually more like conflict resolution. And yeah, sometimes I find there's a 5%er in the middle of it, and sometimes I find a team that just hasn't put any effort into building and maintaining a good team environment or good team processes. And that's an easy fix. We can just help the team work out ways of working together that create the harmony that they've been missing. But often if there's a 5%er in the mix, we have to create some very firm agreements. All I can do really is go in and get the team to reset and restate their own team agreements for how they're going to work together, what they are going to do or not do with each other, so that they can have a productive team environment. And once again, not just a nice to have, not just so that people are happier, and it really does come down to people's engagement levels. And engagement is a really important aspect of the workplace experience, because all the studies show that engagement levels in a team or an organisation impact on every other success criteria. Impacts on retention of staff, it impacts on productivity, on client satisfaction, on client outcomes. And I don't know if you know, but Google did a big survey of a study of its teams and groups, because they need great teamwork there to get the levels of innovation that are necessary. And they found that teams that scored well on psychological safety actually did better on every other criteria. So personally, I think it is part of the leader's role to lead the culture of the team or the organisation, to even be the director of emotional safety, see it as an important part of their work, as to set and maintain the culture that they need to deliver on the work. And if the leader doesn't lead the culture, then the people will, and that's where things can be at risk if it's unattended. And you probably would have heard that statement, culture eats strategy for lunch. It's a huge part of the formula, and it's hard to turn around once we lose positive culture. It's hard to turn around, but it is possible. Now, the most useful aspect of this research that I found, particularly as a consultant going in and working with teams, is that they did some classification. They classified the behaviours that came up in the leaders' stories into one of three types of behaviour. And I thought you'll have examples sitting in your mind as you're looking at that. It'd be just interesting to see if the behaviours fit the categories here, if this covers your examples. But the first category was shaming behaviours. Any behaviours that caused others to feel small, fearful, intimidated, ashamed. So the humiliation, the sarcasm, the pot shots, the temper tantrums are a big one. The bullying behaviours, even the overcritical came up on this, the fault finder. I first researched this whole area. I was doing a bit of consultancy with an organisation, and the organisation had become incredibly toxic. And I think through a mediation process, they were required to have a workplace culture review. And I had to go and look up, and there's a fantastic resource on WorkSafe website, to go and look up what actually constituted bullying, what the behavioural indicators were. And I found a great list that looked at the task-related behaviours around bullying and the personal behaviours around bullying. I thought that was a very helpful separation, but the overcritical, the fault finder, was on the list there. So I'm just really highlighting that it's okay for people to get upset or angry at a meeting. We have a lot of passion and around the missions in our organisations, don't we? So it's okay to get angry at a meeting, but it's not okay to sort of stand up and shout and wave your fists at people in ways that cause others to feel fear. And I just think we have to keep an eye on the systemic results of some of these problematic behaviours, because if one person is shouting in a team, then everybody will feel the impact of that, not just the person that they might be shouting at, that everyone will start to pull back and play it safe so they aren't in the firing line. The passive hostility was the second category, and a little harder to spot, a little harder to put your finger on and to be certain that you're reading the situation correctly. But the more passive ways that people try and show others around them that they're unhappy or they're angry, and try and make their lives a bit miserable. So people who are agreeable to your face but maybe undermine you behind the scenes, the gossiping, the moodiness, people who don't do what they ask. They might say they'll do something and then not. they have the territorial on this, people who kind of guard their own territory and won't release information or let others into their zone. They have the martyr on this list, which is an interesting one. I don't know if you've ever had a staff member or a volunteer who sort of says, I do so much around here, I do so much for these people. It kind of makes them a little bit untouchable, a little bit invincible. I did have a manager on a course one day, and in the break she came up to me and said, I have a staff member who hasn't spoken to me for 4 months, and if I walk in the room, she walks out. What should I do? And I had to say to her, actually, you can't manage someone if they won't speak to you. That needs addressing. So I don't know if you've ever been in a team where, I had another team where they said they used to, I get all these fabulous examples because often I get to interview people privately about their experience in the team. And one person said to me, we kind of have to just watch the door every morning and we look at this person's face to try and figure out what sort of a day we're going to have. Yeah, that was the sort of moodiness and the walking on eggshells there. And the third category I thought was a little bit dramatic, I suppose, when I first read it, but I've had so many examples of this now that it's firmly on my radar. The willful, deliberate sabotage. So people who deliberately withhold or don't share information. We've had examples of people deliberately changing information on budget lines so that projects fall over. We've had examples of staff members and surveillance, people keeping dossiers on other staff members, sort of times and dates they left the car park. That's not normal, is it? And often withdrawing of efforts deliberately. We've had examples of professionals lying at meetings and dropping other professionals in it. We've had examples of professionals asking people questions in a public setting at meetings and they know they don't have the answer to it, that they can't answer it. Yeah, so quite out there behaviours. So Natalie's going to launch a second poll. I just thought we'd do a bit of a survey while we have you all here. And do these behaviours, like the examples or the experiences that you've had, and you can tick as many as apply for this one, would you say they fitted in the shaming behaviours, the passive-aggressive behaviours, or the team sabotage? I'll give you a few moments.
While people are filling in the poll, Ellie, there's a few questions sort of related in chat box. One is, Ellie, do you think most of the 5%ers realize they are toxic?
Great question.
And the other question is, what about the people who don't realize they are toxic?
I can firmly, let's just have a look at the poll and then we will definitely come to that question. Right. Most people have done their voting there. Yeah, so the team sabotage maybe not as likely, but certainly the shaming behaviours and the passive-aggressive behaviours, very common, yeah. And yeah, I just think we've got to keep an eye on the temper tantrums, the little outbursts, the hissy fits there, and really get nice and clear ourselves that that is not okay to exhibit those behaviours in the not-for-profit organisation or in any organisation, but particularly, once again, in the not-for-profit organisation. There's a nice phrase that I use that talks about manner over matter. And in a nutshell, it pretty much says that no matter what we're talking about, no matter what the issue is, no matter what the content of a problem or conversation is, that we still have to deal with it and approach it in a professional manner. And it is your right to call and ask for professional behaviour in the workplace. Now that really takes us to that question of, do the 5%ers realise? And I think often as a strategy, particularly as leaders, we try and help people see the impact they're having, or we help them see themselves as other people see them. And unfortunately, just in this particular zone, in the 5% zone, this is kind of part of the syndrome. is that these folks never view themselves as part of the problem. They actually always see the problem as outside of themselves, other people or the organisation or something else going on. So, and it's not that they refuse to see themselves, it's that literally they don't have the self-awareness to see themselves as other people see them. They don't have the insight into their own behaviours. And that is why we can't kind of hope that they will change. We can't wait for them to change. We actually have to step up and manage the change process. It's not going to happen by itself. Is there another question there, Natalie?
Yes, we have. What about a colleague who constantly talks? And also someone says yes, and when it's an unconscious response, how do we manage this in a team?
Yeah, great questions. And once again, you know, I think we're starting to distinguish between annoying habitual behaviours or toxic behaviours that have a bit of a different feel to them. And I actually often say to leaders, just trust your instincts on this. If it doesn't feel good, if it doesn't feel right, and if you find yourself acting in ways that aren't gracious or aren't typical for you, then you may have a toxic personality on your hand rather than just a bit of an annoying habit. So the test is, and one of the tests is around this zone, is that have you already had a conversation with someone about the issue? And did that kind of help? Did that help them change the behaviour? Did they have the awareness to consider it and look at themselves? Because then you're probably dealing with a functional adult. But if stepping up to a conversation about a difficult behaviour just leads to someone ramping it up and kind of going on the attack, or, you know, that's when the personal grievance gets placed on your desk the next morning, usually with the word bully in it, then that's the signal that you are probably dealing with a toxic personality and some toxic behaviour that is probably unlikely to change very much. Any other questions there relevant, Natalie, before we have a look at what to do about it?
Someone is also asking, I wonder what you do when the toxic personality is left, but the team is still struggling with what's left behind.
It's interesting because the research firmly found that, and that's the word toxic, isn't it? It's a little bit contagious. It kind of spreads and gets into people's systems. Yes, so the research definitely found that even after the toxic personality had left the building, the toxicity remained. And that's an effect of everyone needing to pull on their own coping strategies just in order to survive themselves. So they started to become habitual and part of the habitual team behaviours as well. And really that is the biggest advice we give to teams or organisations, and is your number one strategy, that we do need to address this at a cultural level in a team or an organisation. And the absolute best thing you can do around minimising your risks in this zone is prevention, is to have such strong, healthy, positive cultures where people are so clear on what, you know, good functional professional behaviour is, that as soon as someone starts acting in any of these zones, kind of everyone looks at them and goes, what? That's not who we are, that's not what we do. That the positivity just, yeah, it's interesting that difficult people find it hard to live and survive in very positive cultures. So it's one of your key strategies. And the research clearly found that to address this, or even to begin to address it, we have to deal with it on a number of levels, on the organisational level, on a cultural level. We have to have leaders who are standing for civility, respect and regard right from the top, and who are modelling good leadership, respectful behaviours at every layer. That we also have to be willing to deal with it on a team level. Team leaders have to be empowered to step up and set good standards around interpersonal behaviours and be able to call their team members around that. And we also sometimes need to deal with it on an individual level, actually deal with the individual and have conversations with them about their problematic behaviours. But interestingly, the research found that that was the least effective of the 3 levels, that it got the least amount of change, but it was effective the more senior the person was who was stepping up to the conversations with the difficult person. The more senior they were, the more likely it was to affect some change in behaviour. And this is the time to pull in senior people, pull in authority, pull in your policies, get out your big guns, so that people feel you're really serious and that you actually have some authority to step up here. So when I go in and work with a team, I'm just cycling back to the person's question about how do you deal with the toxicity that remains in a team even after someone has left. So when I find myself doing team building with a team that has a 5%er in the middle of it, I will often interview in every individual in the team so that I can get an accurate picture of people's experience there. And then I'm able to hold up that data to the team as a whole and say, collectively, this is what you said. This is your experience of the team here. And we can make that anonymous. And then the only piece of work I can really do with the team is to help them set a new agreement, to help them work out together how the team will operate going forward, what sorts of agreements, what do we need to agree on to do or not do, so that we can have the right culture, the right environment within the team to support the work that we do. And in some teams, it's almost become a code of civility that we've had to come up with, or communications agreement. There's one team where I had to write that literally one of their bullet points was that if someone greets you, then you need to reply. That was the level that things had got to. So yeah, don't be afraid to do that defining. This is what we do, this is what we don't do, this is what's okay, this is what's not okay in this team. And then the leader has a job, or the team leader has a job, to then hold the team accountable, the individuals in the team accountable to the new agreement that they've entered into. And I learned fairly early on that it really wasn't worth my coming in and doing the work, setting the new agreement, unless the manager was willing to get some coaching if they needed around being able to step up and monitor the new agreement. So that has become critical to the success. And what I found is that if we do that well, if the team sets the agreement, if the manager is willing to step up and call people, hold people accountable around their behaviours, then probably within 6 or 7 weeks, I will get a call from the manager and they'll say to me, they've resigned. And we go, yay. And it's like problem solved. And it's not always pleasant. They often resign with a hiss and a fluff and a whole load of, dissatisfaction. But the team now has a chance of living up to that new agreement and resetting the culture. And sometimes we have to have, some good conversations, some healing rituals, if there's been a particularly difficult experience within the team. So that's my sort of just overall around strategies on how to deal with it. Just setting the culture, just setting some good agreements within your team. Transparency, not colluding with any, not hiding the behaviours, actually openly stepping up, adult to adult level, not being punitive, but just being clear, being directive. And as I said, the difficult behaviours and the difficult personalities, they do find it hard to thrive and survive in an environment where people are having conversations about things that don't work for them. And personally, I think it is the leader's role, the responsibility to take some of the blows around this, and because it is much more vulnerable for a colleague to step up. Yeah. So I might pause there and check if there's any other quick questions, Natalie, just in our last couple of minutes.
Yes, we've got a question here. What about people who are in a manager's position? They form close relationships with a staff member, their best buddy.
Yep.
And when the other person does one thing that they don't like, they completely make their life hell and put everyone else against them.
Yes. So 2 things highlighted by that question. The research found it was quite common for there to be special relationships involved in the issue, that the difficult personality would often create a special relationship with someone who might become a buffer for them or a protector. And they often Jekyll and Hyde, nice to these folks, terrible to theirs. And yeah, it's quite difficult. I'm going to say clearly that dealing up the chain when there's toxicity or difficult behaviours or leaders not stepping up is a challenging mode. And organisations that are really serious about these issues will usually set up clear messages and processes. They call it skip evaluation. They clearly say to staff, if you're not happy with your quality of the leadership that you're getting, you have permission to go to your leader's leader and share your dissatisfactions there, and that leader will have some responsibility about requiring others to demonstrate good leadership. So you can see the sort of systemic whole of organisational viewpoint there, and that we've got to get it right at every level, and it's got to be modelled from the top.
That sort of leads into the next question. What are some of the healing rituals that you do?
Yeah. It's the respectful conversations, really. So I have sometimes sat with a team after they've been through a very difficult period, and people have had the chance just to talk about their experience, how it was for them, their regrets, their sadness about it, the ways they blamed themselves. And quite frankly, I think that's the most powerful thing of the workshop. We have a half-day workshop in this zone, and I have very intelligent, very committed people coming to that. And within the first hour, when we've done the naming and the defining, I have a number of people who go, that's it, I've got what I need, I've got what I came for. I've been able to talk about this. Someone has said, yep, this is what it is. It's not you, this is the area you're dealing with. This is a very challenging zone, and there are some limits to the effect you can have. And that's just taken away the sort of blame and the shame and the doubting of themselves and restored their confidence as leaders. So I think that's a really important part of the healing process. And I think our EAP services are really helpful when this zone has been triggered as well. We can give people some opportunities, have some in-depth healing conversations there.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. I think my screen has frozen again, Natalie. I'll just move us to our last slide. We are needing to finish up in a moment or so, not to cut into your evening. Yeah. So I might hand back to you, Natalie. I think that's our time up.
Yes, time is flying when you're having fun.
Yeah.
I hope we all enjoyed and you've all got something out of it. No doubt you did. I always learn new things when I'm listening to Aly. Thank you, Aly, for sharing your expertise with us. And I'd also like to say thank you all for joining us during Mental Health Awareness Week. We've also got some other webinars coming up. One of them is Leaders as Coaches. We've done that one quite a few times with Aly before, and we just get really great reviews on that one. It's very helpful if you are in a manager's position to do that workshop. It's in Hamilton at the end of the month next week. But we've also got Managing Difficult Personalities and Toxic Behaviour. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the topic that we discussed tonight, that's a 2-hour workshop also with Aly. Highly recommended. Thank you again.
And that's a virtual one. Yeah.
Yeah, that is a virtual one. The Leaders as Coaches is in person. As I mentioned in the chat, we have recorded the session, so you will be receiving the link and you can watch it again if you like. Aly, anything you want to add?
Just thank you for being there with the silent audience, but yeah, I saw a few faces, so that was really helpful, just seeing people's interest and care, around coming to a topic like this. Thank you so much. Hope that's been useful.
Right. The chat is full with thank you so much, Aly. Thank you very much, Aly. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yes. Thanks everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Ka kite.